I have no doubt violated the very basic principles of proper history teaching with this discussion of Moscow's history since the 12th century, but I hope you will forgive me for moving on now to some comparisons regarding the physical layout of the two cities. To begin with, we'll discuss the population and how it affected the physical layout. Moscow's population grew slowly and steadily, as we can see in the graph below, during the first 3 centuries following its inception. While it staggered in the opening stages of the 1700s, by the year 1800 it had grown to 250,000 and was to break 1 million by the end of the century. Although population growth was strong and consistent, it was dwarfed by that of Edo, which itself had already reached 250,000 in the early 1700s and had surpassed 1 million by 1800. This has obvious implications for the physical layouts of the cities, as is reflected in the comparison of the two maps. The Edo map is far more cluttered and congested near the center of the city than its Russian counterpart. And while this could be blamed on a lack of attention to detail in the Moscow map, a cursory glance at the far more vast urban sprawl in the Edo map reveals that the population is indeed having an effect on the layout of the city. Another aspect that affected the physical layout of Moscow were its estates. Up until 1861, Moscow, and indeed much of Russia, employed a system of serfdom. This meant that a vast and diverse and serf peasantry served an elite and small noble class for much of Moscow's existence. This was compounded when, in the early 18th century, Catherine the Great decentralized local administrative duties belonging to the nobles from the capital, St. Petersburg. A small minority of this 50-odd thousand nobles chose to travel to Moscow and settle there. This certainly had a distinct effect on the physical layout of the city, one that remarkably resembles that of Edo. Vast noble estates, many of which remain today, share a stark semblance with the daimyo estates of the Tokugawa period. Moreover, in the interest of being near resources and of lying within the protection of city walls, these privileged class settled near the Kremlin, meaning that, just as urban sprawl and space increased nearer to Edo Castle, land and homes became more spacious and prestigious near the center of Moscow. In contrast between the two, while the land on which many daimyo estates rested is now home to skyscrapers and public housing, many of Moscow's noble estates have been carefully preserved, and some have since become converted into museums and historical sites. The Demidov House, shown here, is one such estate, which is preserved and is now a popular tourist destination. Natural elements also had an effect on the physical layout of the city. As mentioned earlier, fires frequently struck the Moscow area. As early as the beginning of the 17th century, city planners were augmenting and redesigning Moscow's layout in an effort to battle the deadly flames. The Kremlin administered countless mandates to alter the construction and development of the city. For example, to prevent congested street houses from catching fire, streets were made to be at least 70 feet wide and alleys 42. This is almost immediately noticeable in our 1808 map of Moscow. Roads are clearly visible even from this far distance, and they appear thicker than, in contrast, the Edo map. Also, we know that the Cho, while neatly planned and orderly maintained, consisted of much narrower streets, rarely approaching anywhere near the 70 feet demanded by the Kremlin, and this suggests that Edo administration, perhaps in part due to a much higher population than Moscow, chose not to employ this particular firefighting method. Moscow and Edo share one major topographical aspect, one that appears to be essential to any prosperous city: proximity to water. Moscow isn't gifted with an ocean shore, as Edo is. Instead, the Kremlin is located north of the Krimsky Ford, which is the confluence of the Yauza and Moskva rivers. In this map to the right, you can see the Yauza outlined in blue, entering Moscow from the east, and the Moskva River in red, swooping in from the south. The proximity to rivers had the same effect as the Sumida River did in Edo. The Moskva allowed goods to be shipped to and from major cities to the northwest and west of Moscow, while the Yauza provided a dual purpose: first, as a shipping route, and second, as a water source for the peasantry living beyond the outer walls of Moscow. The Moskva in particular played a crucial role in the actual construction of Moscow. It facilitated the transition from primarily wood construction to masonry, which took place at the turn of 18th century, because its 500-kilometer length allowed Moscovian city planners to transport large amounts of stone made in St. Petersburg to the north via the river to Kremlin. As a result, many buildings within the Kremlin began to appear with stonework, partly to reduce the fire hazard, and partly as a conscious effort to produce classical Western European construction, which will be discussed in the next section. Before we do that, though, I thought it would be interesting to see how these rivers are integrated into the city today, and how those integrations compare between the two cities. We'll begin with a look at Moscow's rivers, and after that, we'll look at Edo. Here again are the Moskva and Yaza rivers, outlined in red and blue, respectively. Now, let's zoom in a little bit more and get rid of those lines. Now I'll fade in a map taken from Google Earth of a satellite view of the rivers. And here, I'll place them side by side. As we can see, for the most part, the course of the Moskva River through Moscow seems unaltered, and those places in which it seems to be could simply be a result of slightly inaccurate map-making back in 1808. Interestingly, it seems that, in 200 years, very few, only 3, new bridges have been built across the large section of the river. I did some quick research and found that the same cannot be said regarding London and its Thames River, and Paris and the River Seine, 2 other major cities during that era which continued to build across their rivers throughout their history. There could be several reasons for this. The first, of course, is that there is no reason, and that this was simply a result of the natural city planning and course of history. While this is obviously not an exciting conclusion, it certainly is a possibility. However, in the interest of scholarship and research, I propose a couple different reasons. In 1812, 4 years after the map to the left was made, Napoleon's forces invaded and devastated Moscow, as described earlier. Although I could not find any specific data, from what I understand, it seems as though the invaders came from the west and the south, because accounts that I have read indicate that the Muscovites fled to the north and east. This means then that at one point Napoleon must have been able to cross the river into Moscow during the invasion. I propose then that following these dark times, Moscow city planning authorities consciously resisted constructing more bridges over the Moskva River to ensure that in the future, invading forces would not have an easy time entering the city. Another theory is best understood in the context of bridges in Edo. We know that bashi, or bridges, played an important cultural and economic role in the composition of Edo. For example, Nihonbashi was a social gathering place, where people could gather on weekend afternoons to exchange goods, stories, and laughs, and also where they gathered during festivals. Economically, markets like the Ufenocho, or fish market, were located on and around Nihonbashi, and were important contributors to the community as well. Given this context, we can understand why there does not seem to be a strong emphasis on bridges in Moscow. Moscow's bridges were not at all cultural landmarks or social gathering places as they were in Edo. They were simply places to get from point A to point B across the river. Moreover, inside this horseshoe created by the Moskva River, as it intersects the outermost wall at the south of Moscow, there was a high concentration of noble estates, meaning that relatively few people actually lived there. As such, there was not as much of a need to construct several bridges across the Moskva, since there was not much traffic going to and from the southern end of the city. Before we get back to more physical layout comparisons, let's take a quick look now at the Yaza River, and then after that, the Sumida River in Edo. Here again is the river in blue. And here is the Google Maps image of the river without any marking on it. As you can see, the river now much resembles a canal more than anything else, as it is small, brown in color, and has many crossing points over it. I have a theory for why and when this transition might have taken place. By the turn of the 19th century, when the Moscow map was made, much of downtown Moscow had been converted into masonry from wood. With this significantly decreased fire hazard, and therefore no real need for the river's water for the Kremlin, water from the Yaza River took on a different purpose. Rather than firefighting, it became irrigation and peasant water supplies. As such, it became canalized and manipulated to serve as a water source for the peasantry living outside of the walls. This could explain why the Yaza River now much more resembles a canal or irrigation system than an actual river. Now, let's take a look at Edo's main river, Sumida, and see how its changes throughout the years compare with those of Moscow's.